Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities' first Lunch and Learn program of 2023. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center. I'm speaking to you from beautiful Seattle, Washington, the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples. When settlers arrived in Seattle in 1851, the Coast Salish people had been living in this area for almost 4,000 years. Today, students all over the area return to school after winter break. My own two teens dragged themselves out the door this morning, unused to the early wake-up time after days of sleeping in. Other students will return to school after unknown challenges at home and will attempt to refocus on the demands and structure of school. Our schools are full of children who have experienced trauma, and teachers and administrators will tell you that these students come with passion, but also a host of challenges. Today, we are going to hear about a school in Switzerland set up to teach children who were survivors of the Holocaust. One of these students was Ruth Mermelstein, a 16-year-old and a survivor of Bergen-Belsen. Ruth's daughter is here to tell us about this unconventional school and her mother's experiences to try to put the pieces together after surviving the horrors of the Holocaust. Here we are at the start of a new year, January 2023. I'm sure that some of you have made New Year's resolutions or have considered what you might want in the year ahead. If you are willing to share it, please let us know in the chat. And the chat is open, so please feel free to put in your comments or remarks or what you hope for in the year ahead. I think the world and each one of us could use a little extra compassion right about now. In this new year, I'm reminding myself to pause before passing judgment on others, to pause and ask, what else could be going on in that person's life? It's a reminder to zoom out a little bit and see individuals in a larger context. It's a reminder to not define a person by a single action or a single moment. What else could be going on in that person's life? I've said it to my teenagers when they come home from school with stories about students or even their teachers. Maybe some of you watching will want to join me in this effort to just pause, slow the judgment, and have a little more compassion for people in this next year. Shifting gears, I want to invite you all to our next in-person program on January 26th at the Museum of Flight, which will be in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The program is in-person only and will discuss one of the lesser-known aspects of the Holocaust, what has become known as the Holocaust by bullets. When we talk about the Holocaust, we often talk about camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, or Majdanek, or we discuss stories of rescue and hiding in Poland, France, or the Netherlands. Of the 6 million Jewish people killed in the Holocaust, 1/3 of them were executed in the fields, forests, and ravines of the former Soviet Union and other countries of Central Europe. And yet these stories, more than 2 million of them, are too rarely told, recognized, and remembered. On this day of remembrance, we will hear from Eva Schaller from Yahad in Unam about her personal experiences uncovering eyewitness stories from the Holocaust in Ukraine, and even decades later about the current and ongoing war crimes investigations in Ukraine. This program is in-person only and will not be streamed or recorded. You can register for it on our website. Today, I am so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Bernice Lerner. Bernice Lerner is the author of All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and other writings on the Holocaust and on virtue ethics. She is the former Dean of Adult Learning at Hebrew College, former lecturer on the Holocaust at Boston University, and a senior scholar at Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility. All told, she has more than 25 years of experience in the field of adult education. It has been her great privilege, she describes, to create and implement innovative programs, lead productive teams, and work with outstanding faculty in the realms of philosophy, education, and Jewish studies. On a more personal note, Bernice explains that she grew up on Long Island, where her immigrant parents tried to adopt American ways of life. She writes, she is sorry they spent their hard-earned money on piano and ballet lessons, for which she had little aptitude, but she loved to draw and to write and would copy the text of whatever was in front of her. She also loved to organize and lead activities, a skill and passion that she has carried on through her adult and professional life. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the program. Please add your questions at any time into the Q&A feature on Zoom. Bernice, thank you so much for joining us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, Ilana. And thank you so much to the Holocaust Center for Humanity for inviting me to speak. I will begin this program by giving you a little bit of background, explaining how my mom came to this school in Sweden right after a year after the Holocaust, and what that school did for her. I should mention just a couple of things. One is you're having an upcoming program by Yachad im Unum, and they talk about the massacre by bullets, Jews being slaughtered, massacred. I just want to say that my mom's two of her aunts, 2 of her uncles, and 5 of her little cousins under the age of 10 were killed in the first such massacre of the Holocaust. So it's very much a part of my family story and such a great tragedy. And if I could be there, I would come to that program. The other thing I want to mention is also related to something Ilana touched upon, which is the trauma that so many of our young people have experienced during the pandemic, and even other kinds of trauma, not necessarily pandemic related, but things that have happened in their life. So I am not a professional trauma specialist. I'm not going to be able to tell you whether this school that my mom attended in Sweden that really turned her life around had some relevant methodology to things that are happening today. Maybe you would find it true for cases of children who are refugees of wars, but I leave it to the experts to decide that. I'm just going to describe to you what happened. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about about my mother's journey and how she wound up in this place. So I'm going to share my screen now. I will play this from the start. So my mom is from this town of Sziget, and when she grew up, it was Romania. It was Hungary during the time of the war. Now it is once again Romania. It is the place that it was made famous by Elie Wiesel. He was her neighbor. He lived like 5-minute walk from her house. And her journey was very traumatic. I talk about it in the book I wrote about her. And I explain how she wound up in Auschwitz, and then a labor camp, and then a death march, and then Bergen-Belsen. And here in this talk, I'm going to focus on her journey to Sweden. But from Bergen-Belsen, it was a 1.5-hour train ride to Hamburg, another hour to Lübeck, which was the port from which the refugees departed. Now, I tell not only my mother's story in my book, but I also tell the story of the British allies who liberated Bergen-Belsen. And I focus on one protagonist for that part of the book, and that is Glyn Hughes, who led the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So just a quick note, this is a picture from Army Talks magazine. This is the first war crimes trial to apply international law to the crimes of the Nazis, immediately preceding the very famous Nuremberg trials. This was the Lüneburg trial, and my protagonist, Glyn Hughes, served as the first witness at this trial. My book starts with a prologue. The meat of the book is sandwiched in between some compelling information about this Belsen trial, and then I have an epilogue. And what I'm going to share with you today is a lot of images and pictures that are not in my book, but that are referred to in the epilogue. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, the Swedish government, the King of Sweden, very quickly, really right after the war, at May of 1945, decided in a humanitarian gesture that he would take up up to 10,000 of the very sick survivors from Bergen-Belsen and bring them to Sweden and rehabilitate them. There were 25,000 people in Bergen-Belsen who were immediately in need of hospitalization as soon as the liberators came in. There was another 35,000 who were ambulatory but still had typhus or were sick, but they didn't need that kind of critical care right away. It's a bigger story, what the liberators found when they entered Bergen-Belsen, but suffice it to say there were 55 to 60,000 people there, displaced. They called them displaced persons. They had no idea where they were from. They were from all of the Nazi occupied countries in Europe. And this is a little statistical thing I did. There was about 1,200 people from Romania, from the part that my mom was from, Transylvania, who were found in Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war. And there were 174 people from Siget who wound up going to Sweden. Now, there were some people most people were killed, right? They were killed right away in Auschwitz. We're talking about the ones who were strong enough. They evaded the gas chambers. They worked in slave labor. They survived the death marches, and they wound up in this hell, this dumping ground called Bergen-Belsen toward the end of the war. Most of the people, there were some people who were healthy who tried to go back to their hometown or went other places, but 174 of the people from Siget, which was a town of 12,000 before the war, 12,000 Jews, 30,000 people in total, about 174 were taken to Sweden, people from Siget who arrived in Sweden. And this just shows you roughly the age range of people who had like sort of the best chance of surviving the war. Like there was only one person who was in her early 50s, maybe it was a man, but most people who the greatest chance of survival were people who were in their early 20s. My mom was among the younger ones. She was youngest. She was born in 1929. Her sister was born in 1928. And you can see that they are among a smaller group of people who survived the war and wound up going to Sweden. I should also say that the journey from Lübeck to Lund, people died on the way there. People died as they were arriving. People died in the weeks and months and years after the war. The places that people were sent to upon arriving and being quarantined, they were sent all throughout the country to be healed, to be taken care of, to have medical treatment. There are cemeteries, there are graves everywhere with survivors of the Holocaust, because it was really hard. 90% of the people who came over had tuberculosis. They were very, very sick. And now I'm going to show you something that you're not going to be able to find on YouTube. This is rare film footage of the rescue of the war-ravaged survivors from Bergen-Belsen being brought over to Sweden. And this is actually the ship that my mother was taken on. It was called the Crown Princess Ingrid, and it had about 400 people on board. There was 4 other ships that were employed for this transit of refugees who came to Lübeck. Some of them came on stretchers. They were either standing or sitting. If they were able to walk, they were put into special train cars where they could sit. Otherwise, they were laying down and they were put on stretchers. And you can see what kind of humanitarian mission this was. I'm going to just show you some of this footage. It's silent, so you're just going to hear the projector reel. You're not going to hear any voices. You're going to see images here of the Swedish rescuers, the people on this humanitarian mission, the nurses, the orderlies, a doctor or two. Pay attention to what the survivors are wearing who come on the boat. Are they wearing any kind of like identification necklace? Look also at the length of their hair. So how much could it have grown after it had been shaved off in Auschwitz? The condition of the people. And I'm just going to show you some film now. please know that this is 13 minutes long, and I'm going to skip quickly over certain sections. I don't think you need to see the whole thing. You're going to get a taste of it. You're going to see how the Swedish, the humanitarian rescuers are decorating the boat. It's festive. They're going over to rescue these people. You're going to see people boarding. You're going to see what it's like when they're on the ship, and you're going to see them disembarking. So I will pause at certain points in this film. I'm not going to show you the naked people being washed. I'm going to try to skip over those parts. The Swedes were very afraid of bringing in infected people into the country, so they tried very hard to disinfect them, even to the discomfort and the dismay of some of the survivors. Some of the handling of them was kind of rough and difficult for them to go through the process of being washed and disinfected. So. Oops, sorry. So, sorry, I apologize. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I wanted you to see that because to appreciate the condition of a lot of the people. And I'll tell you a little bit about my mom. She was not on a stretcher when she came onto the boat. She was 15 years old and her sister was 17, and they were young and they didn't even know how to advocate for themselves and try to come over on the same boat. So my mother was alone, and she found two other girls and they hid under the stairwell in the boat, and they thought it was really funny when people wanted to come share their space. They said, we have a communicable disease. And they did have a disease. They were really sick, but they were kids and they were hiding out in their comfortable, cozy spot. So anyway, this is a situation under which these refugees arrived in Sweden. The Swedish government thought that they would give them some care, and in about 6 months, they would be repatriated. They go to their home countries, they would go on their way. And this didn't happen in most cases. And my mom, just PS, wound up staying in Sweden for 10 years after the war. And she was in and out of tuberculosis sanitariums at the time. So she was in a quarantine in Malmö, and then she was taken to a place called Katrina Home, which was a makeshift hospital and a school. There was about 135 places all around Sweden that the refugees were taken. And then she was taken to snowy Northwest Sweden to a tuberculosis sanitarium in Arvika. So I'm just going to show you some images. This is the very first, earliest photograph we have of my mother. Here she is, a group of young, you could see there's a lot of young teenagers being taken care of in this hospital in Sweden, makeshift in a school. And this is a blow up of her picture. And you can still see that she has bruises under her eyes. She was very severely beaten up even after the liberation. And she's very sick here. She has a vacant look in her eyes. And this Dr. Leffler, nursed her to health. And then my mother winds up going from there to a tuberculosis sanitarium in snowy Northwest Sweden, to this place called Arvika. And here she is in Arvika. This is the cover of my book, the US edition, and this is the UK edition. And you can see my mother in full form. You can see here that she's well nourished by this point, but you can see that she's not a joyful survivor. She's orphaned, she's sick, she's in this tuberculosis sanitarium, and there's a lot of questions about her future, and really mourning and grieving the loss of her health, because she was a really strong physical tomboy of a kid, and now she can't do anything. So from Arvika, after many months in Arvika, she's taken to a rest home in this place called Vikarbyn. And from there, when she's deemed healthy enough, about 1 year after the war's end, she goes to this place in Smedsbo. And this is where the school is located. So she's healthy enough, she's deemed healthy enough to go to school. So there was a lot of logistical coordination. The rescue of refugees was done by the state's Foreign Commission and Royal Civilian Guard and the Board of Naval Logistics in Sweden. There was a governmental order in September 1945. They realized that they had some kids among those being brought over. The young among the homeless should have some schooling. So they set up 10 Internat, the international Internat schools in various locations. International because these were kids from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. And the place my mother wound up, there were people from Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and there was one person from Greece and one person from Italy. So these were Internat schools, and student recruitment began. And it was quite a process to recruit students. It involved lengthy conversations to convince them. They didn't like change. They were fearful of change. And there was one man who was in charge of 5 refugee camps. His name was Eli Gitroy. And a lot of my presentation from this point forward is owed to Eli Gitroy, because he was a doctoral student at the time. And he wrote his thesis about this experience of working with refugee girls, survivors of Nazi concentration camps, mostly girls. And my mother was lucky enough. He was in charge of 5 refugee camps. He set up one school that he was the head of himself. And my mother was lucky enough to wind up in that school in Smedsbo in the Dalarna region. And she always referred to it by the nearby village, which was called, it's spelled like this, but she called it Bichubi. So it was Bichubi. My whole life I heard about Bichubi. And it was in a remote place, about 2 hours from Stockholm, or an hour and a half from Stockholm. Here there was a main building. It was about a half an hour drive from the train station to get to the school down this road. And there were a lot of cottages set up around for girls to live in. The main building was for the sickest girls, and my mother was one of them. And the teachers were, Elie Gatroy recruited, here's Elie Gatroy, he recruited all the teachers, and he had to recruit a cook and staff. He was the man who's the, I guess, patron head of the school. And the teachers, there were from anywhere from 2 to 5 teachers at any given time in the school. But the main ones that my mother always talked about was this woman, Vali and Ali, and she called her Valika and Alika. And Valika taught, Valika taught Jewish studies, and she was a teacher from before the war in Jewish history and Hebrew. And Alika taught the humanities and literature and history, and Elie Gatroy taught also classical music to the girls. So these teachers loomed very large in my mind as I was growing up, because even though my mother, the school was in existence for 2 years, most of the girls stayed from 9 months to 2 years. Some of them had relapses, had to go back to sanatoriums, in and out. My mother was there for 7 months, but it was 7 months that changed her entire life. So here's a group picture in front of the main building, and that's my mother in profile. And in writing my book and writing the story, you have to realize that I had to sort of divorce myself from being the daughter, and had to look at who was this little girl. I was thinking of I call her my mother during this presentation, but who was this Rachel? Her name was Rachel Ginuth. And who was this kid, and what was she experiencing? And really, she was among these other girls. And how do you take a group of young people? There were about 52 people in the school. And how do you take them from the concentration camp to the classroom? It took a lot of, as I said, it took a lot of convincing for them to even enroll in the school. It started out with 35 people, but quickly through word of mouth, it grew to 52. But how could environmentally damaged teenagers concentrate on learning? That's how they thought of them, environmentally damaged. Why should they trust authority? They had seen horrible things happen. Their frame of reference was different than other kids. And if you were to put them in a regular high school, it would have been, a lot of young survivors did go mainstream into regular schools, but what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had experienced really made them different from the other students. And these young people, they had to snap to it when there was a capo. They would make jokes. When one of them was distributing food to the others, she would say, "Now I'm not Lager Altesta," the head of the bunk, the barracks. I mean, they had a different frame of reference. And some of them had seen one of them saw her brother beaten to death by a baton. Another had to sort her friend's clothes as she was going into the gas chamber. Her friend went into the gas chamber, and they had they lost their families, their parents, and how to fortify them for their uncharted future. Really, some of them were so bitter. Some of them had screaming fits. They yelled at the teachers. It depended on the personality, right, of the kid. Every one of the students was a riddle in their own way, but they all suffered a lot. Many of them were initially disillusioned, resigned, sad, withdrawn, fragile, sensitive, wary, bitter, needy, ungrateful, pessimistic, and perplexed. They were uncertain. Did any of their loved ones survive? Where could they make their future lives? When they had mail time, it was fraught because everybody was waiting for a letter. Might they have heard? I think out of all I only know of one story where one girl learned that her father had survived. And when she learned that he remarried, she felt very betrayed. But everyone would gather around, and if someone got a phone call, they would all gather around the hall to listen in. It was everything, anything could be a trigger. Anything could be a trigger. Birthdays of relatives could be a trigger. They could break down crying. If they were taken on an outing and they walked by a farm and there were chickens, it could have reminded someone of their parents' chicken farm. They could break down crying. It was you really, this school, these teachers gave a lot of thought as to how to deal with girls who came out of this kind of situation. And they worried, like they didn't know, how would they ever take care of themselves? They had no parents. How would they ever get well? Would they get well? So the goals of the school, it was Ellie Gatroy and Alika and Avalika and whoever else was involved really gave a lot of thought to what kind of school environment they were going to create for these children, these adolescents. And they decided that they were going to do sort of the opposite of what the children had experienced, these authoritarian environments these girls had endured for the past year or longer. They weren't, because they had to obey authority, they weren't going to be such strong authorities. Everything was optional. Whether or not you wanted to learn was optional. What you wanted to learn, you could weigh in on what kind of courses you wanted to take. They gave the girls a lot of latitude, and everyone was called by their first names. It wasn't Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. As I said, there was Alika and Valika and Ellie. They weren't called by their last names. And sometimes this created problems because there was lack of respect for the teachers, right? Some of them had some formal education before the war, or they were 17, and they had some schooling where they had a lot of respect for their teachers. And here, anything could go. So they could lash out at the teachers, but the teachers had to navigate between not being martyrs, having the students take responsibility for their own learning, and being really sensitive to them, helping them to find meaning in their existence, to broaden their intellectual horizons and inspire them to take responsibility for their own learning, to provide new positive experiences, right? The Holocaust, it wasn't called the Holocaust then, but the war, what they had gone through wasn't the only thing in this world. There were other positive things could enter and begin new lives in positive atmospheres. And they tried to create a collective, a large supportive family to fill in, right, for all the missing relatives that the girls had. They tried to encourage adaptability, right? You don't know where you're going to wind up making your home, making your lives. You have to adapt to different environments. You have to learn how to be in the world with other people. You have to be tolerant and care about others. And they tried to relieve students of their hatefulness, to inspire them to find goodness and beauty in the world. Beauty. Alika impressed my mother, and my mother repeated this as I was growing up. Try to live near a city so you can partake of culture. We can only give you a taste in this school. We only have you for a short period of time. We're going to expose you to opera, to classical music, to ballet, but you have to go and seek such opportunities for yourself. They tried to fortify them for the future and to foster self-respect, trust, and the ability to think for themselves. If they came to the teachers with problems, which they did as they warmed up to them, they came to them, the teachers would maybe give suggestions, but they always encouraged them to think for themselves, to weigh everything in balance and decide the best course of action. So here's a quote from a former student. They enabled us to differentiate the essential from the non-essential, to actively and independently problem solve. So there were some sort of advantages. There were girls from every kind of background. There were girls who were daughters of rabbis, of business owners, of factory owners, of farmers, of tradespeople, and they came from really all kinds of backgrounds, many from traditional Jewish backgrounds, but not all, some from secular backgrounds. But the diversity of their backgrounds was not important in view of the common experiences they recently had. The concentration camps were some kind of great equalizer. Everybody was in the same horrible boat. And the loneliness gave way to very intense friendships. And my mother, you know, she was very shy and withdrawn, but she did make her closest friends in her life, I would say, at this school. And because it was isolated, it was created a feeling of home. It was far away from other places, and there was real motivation for learning because the girls realized this might be their last chance in a long time to learn. Because at 18, they had to leave the school, and at 18 was an age at which they should go out and earn their own keep. So they were really motivated to learn. And they didn't know, many of them had their sights on Palestine. So they really wanted to learn Hebrew. They were really motivated. My mother studied until she could memorize 1,000 Hebrew words. They worked hard. So here is my mother, and she is in a sweater she made for herself, and she made the same one for her sister, who's in this group photo. And here she is with her friend Rizy from her hometown, whom she met up with, which must have been like an incredible thing to meet someone from your own home, and her very good friend Miriam. So the classes were optional. The teachers were tender, understanding, and friendly. Everyone was called by their first name. The other thing they did was they set up these democratic practices. Everything was adjudicated by the girls themselves. There was voting, there was self-governance, division of chores, there was extracurricular activities. The classes, there were 2 classes met in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. Everyone had work duties, cleanup duties, and the evening activities became very, very important. They would listen to music, put on plays, performances, learn how to dance, listen, all kinds of things. They had meetings about, there was one beautiful rug. How are they going to rotate it among the different rooms? That was a big discussion. That was like a discussion that you would see at the UN. Everything had to be democratic and fair. And here's my mother with her friend Rizy. And I should just say that when they had an opportunity, when they decided after the second year of the school's existence, they wanted to give the girls 2 weeks vacation. None of them wanted it. They didn't want vacation. They didn't want idle time. They didn't know what they would do at the time. They didn't know where they'd go. They just wanted to be in school and have their regular routine and their activities. And they taught things like, they taught sex education, and they called it child development. They taught language arts, no trade skills, but just discussed politics. These were some of the courses. This was my mother's friend whom she shared a room with, and they came at the same time from Arvika by way of Vikerben, and they came at the same time to Bichubi, and they would study together at night. They would lock themselves in their room just to try to catch up with the learning. And here is the classroom. Here's Ellie Gatroy teaching. And this is like my favorite picture of all time, because here's my mother and she's smiling. Think back to the first picture of her I have after the war in Katrina home, and then the picture of her in Arvika that's on the cover of my book. She's sad, and here she is. She's coming out of her shell slowly, and here she is, clearly smiling and enjoying whatever Ellie Gatroy is teaching. And Ellie Gatroy, I should just say, was a handsome young man. He was probably in his 30s, and a lot of the girls were madly in love with him. So here is one of the contests that they set up. They were going to evaluate who decorated their room the nicest. And just to give you an idea, there was one girl on the judging committee, and one girl from every room on the judging committee, and a teacher. So they went around, and here are the girls in their cottages, in their rooms. And here on the upper left is a picture of the girls performing for a group visiting from Stockholm from the Mosaiska Församlingen, the Jewish organization that was philanthropic and helped pay for some of this. And here their girls are celebrating Santa Lucia, which is a Swedish holiday around Christmas time. And Valika's cut off from this picture, but she's over here observing them. And here they are dancing. And I'm going to talk in a minute about this. There was only girls at the school, mostly girls at the school. So they were learning to dance with each other. And here's a picture. This picture I blew up from a tiny little picture my mother had. And it was these girls dancing around the car coming in the snow. And I said to my mother, why are they like dancing around the car? And she answered me as if it was like the most obvious answer in the world. The car was bringing in a film reel. They were going to see a movie. And that was like a big deal. That was why they were dancing. So finally, in the summer of 1947, about 9 boys come in to join the school. And that was a very big thing. And they were in the same boat as the girls. They were teenagers. They were 16 or 17. And they had also were survivors of the Holocaust. And I remember my mother telling me what an amazing thrill it was when a boy with big brown eyes asked her to dance at a party. They had a lot of parties and dancing. And they had a lot of costume parties, and a lot as a way of sort of an unconscious flight to a problem-free world, a different world. So for Purim, there were Purim plays, and there's Ellie Gatroy, and this is my mother's friend Lily, who was a great actress and always got like the lead part. And this is my aunt, and my mom always loved to dress up as men. They would have like a wedding scene. They were imagining, in a way, they were imagining their futures, having a wedding party, dressing up like this. Here's my mother here. And here's more pictures. This is from some sort of a party where the girls wore their own ties that they knitted themselves. And here they are in their cafeteria, a whole group of them. There's Ellie Gatroy. And here's twins, Miriam and Dora, who were at the school. And they took them on outings. Here's my aunt. She went out with a few girls. They met up with other few girls. What a coincidence. And they took a picture. And here they are berry picking and trying to give the girls fresh air. And their true personalities were allowed to surface in this sort of environment. There was the jokester, and there was the, outgoing one. There was the more aggressive ones. My mother was always sort of shy and stayed in the background, but here's Risey from her hometown, and they called her, here she is, Risey, entertaining the whole group of girls, and they called her the Mosaiska, named after the organization in Stockholm, the Jewish organization. She was a Mosaiska because she was organizing and making joy and levity, like imagining like a great organization would do. And very sadly, about a year later, Risey died of TB, and another girl died in the school of a brain inflammation. So you see these girls, and they're laughing and they're gay and they're really having a great experience in B2B, studying, learning, being in community together, coming back to life slowly, making friends for life. And some of them didn't make it. Some of them just didn't make it. Yeah. So I should just mention before I explain this, there was, all right, I'll explain this first. Sadly, I was going to give this presentation in October, but my mom died suddenly just after she turned 93. And so this talk tonight has been rescheduled, and here I am. But going through her home, I found her autograph book from B2B. And I don't know how many of you, I found some stuff of my own stuff from school, but I saved hers, not mine, because hers was way more interesting than my 6th grade autograph book. But I don't know how many of you have autograph books where people write to you in like at least 4 different languages here. Here's Sweden, Hungarian, German, and Hebrew. So I thought this was kind of interesting, and I took some pictures from it. And I just want to say one other thing about the school before I go on. So one thing was that they had an essay contest twice a month, and the girls picked the themes for the essay contest. One theme was a dream, what's a dream they had, what was one of their most beautiful memories. Another theme was what is the most horrible thing, their most horrible experience. Another theme was what's a funny story, what's the history of a drop of water. And one of the, or another theme could have been, why are the Jews hated? They discussed politics, all kinds of things. So they had these essay contests. And one of the essay contests was, it really struck me because it was like, imagine 20 years from now, you are writing a letter to one of your friends from this school, from B2B Smedsbo, and telling them about your husband and your family. And that was so interesting that they try to have the kids sometimes imagine a future life, their future once they leave this place. What can they do in the world? What are they going to create? What meaning are they going to give their lives? So fast forward 6 years later, my mother is in this business school. And here she is, she's one of maybe 3 girls in this class, but she gets, the big thing about it for her was she gets a ticket for free entrance to the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm. And this I attribute to her teachers, to Alika and Vali and Ellie, who always encouraged them to go to the theater. So that was her favorite thing to do, and she would go regularly and often. And then fast forward 20 years. Here is my mother with her good friend, Olga. And here she is with Olga. And here she is 20 years later with Olga visiting. Olga lived in Israel. My mother lived in the United States. Here, Olga visits her in the United States. And here's my mother visiting with Olga and Miriam in Israel. And here is my Aunt Elizabeth with their friend Miriam. So these, even though they visited just a few times after the war, into their 80s, they were having these really wonderful, beautiful, intimate conversations, long distance over the phone, which were very meaningful. And I think a lot of us have friends from our past. We have friends maybe from high school, maybe from grade school, even maybe from college that we keep up with. But there was some sort of added dimension to me to these friendships because they were really close, like family. So this presentation, a lot of the sources is from Ellie Gatroy's thesis. And it was called Practical Pedagogy in a Boarding School, Experiences from Work with Youngsters Liberated from Concentration Camps. It was written in Swedish, and my mother, in a labor of love, it took her a few months, but she translated the entire thesis. She was probably around in her low 80s, 82 or 83. She translated the whole thesis for me from Swedish into English, so I could use parts of it in my book and to give you this presentation. So thank you for listening. And I'm now going to stop my share.
Bernice, thank you so much for telling us about your mother's story and this really interesting school. I'm wondering, do you know, are there any schools like this that are running today to serve either refugee children or children who have lost their parents during war or traumatic events? Is this model being continued anywhere?
I think so. I mean, I think that I'm not equipped to speak about it. My daughter did her thesis on refugees from Burma, it was more about integrating them into the public school and how teachers should help them. But there are certain places where they are dealing just with refugees, people who suffered this kind of trauma, and whether they use a lot of the same methods, they very well may. I know they exist, I just don't have the details.
As you're describing the school, it reminds me a little bit of the way Korczak ran his orphanage in Warsaw, and the autonomy that he gave to the children and the decision-making processes, that he really put them in charge of their own existence within the school, but with very strict rules and structure still, but they had a lot of leeway to make some of the rules. Do you see some of the connections there, and do you think there was any influence?
That's interesting. Well, certainly Korczak was very famous in Poland. I don't know, these teachers were from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Germany. I think, and Korczak certainly got his ideas from a lot of other people. I mean, he traveled around and he went to Montessori schools, but it reminded me of Korczak in that Korczak, they set up a court system where they adjudicated, you know, if someone was caught stealing, they had a trial, that kind of thing. Korczak's students, when after they kind of, some of them were like you saying to Korczak, you didn't prepare us for the real world. It's not like it was in your orphanage or your school, because they were treated in a certain way. Whereas this school in Bichubi, they tried so hard to prepare the students for the real world. So it was a little bit different. But yeah, there were some similarities. And they're just these teachers who are just really thoughtful educators. How are they going to reach these kids?
Bernice, there's a question that comes from Jill, and she writes, we are wondering how your mother came to the United States, and could you tell us a little bit more about her life after she left the school?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, she was in Sweden for 10 years, total of 10 years, and she was in and out of TB sanatoriums. So this was, the B2B chapter was 7 months out of those 10 years. So she had to make her way after, but what happened was when you turned 18, you had to leave the school. So Ellie Gatroy helped to place the girls in certain work settings, and so they could go together. So a group of 5 girls could go out together and figure out how to rent a place, share chores, room and board, make meals, clean up. So she was, you know, it was scary for her at first, because up until then everything had been taken care of for her, but she learned to do that. And then eventually she and her sister moved out to be near Stockholm, and she had all these adventures in Sweden. I can't go into the details now, but she was a nanny, and that was pretty significant. She worked in a factory, she worked in a hospital, but she came to the United States when her sister married a man who was also a survivor, whose brother was in the United States. They came to the United States. It was her only surviving sister out of a family of, they had 4 younger siblings that didn't make it. Her parents didn't make it. Her aunts, uncles, and cousins didn't make it. She was our only living relative. So when my aunt came to the United States, she promised that she would bring my mother out within the year. And my mother thought, that's not going to happen. That's crazy. But it happened. She found my father, who went to Sweden to meet my mother, and they got married, and he brought her over, and she made the rest of her life in the United States. And yeah, and she was healthy. Once she arrived in the United States, I would say she was pretty healthy. She had many decades of good health and a lot of energy and strength. And I can also tell you that you could not walk into her house without hearing classical music playing or opera. And she really took these teachers' words to heart and knew, like, every opera, every story, she really ran with what they gave her. The taste they gave her, she really developed into a lot of great meals. So.
Bernice, there's another question here, and this probably has to be our last question. And there's actually 2 questions, and they're kind of similar. So I'll read the question here from Marcy, who writes, thank you, Bernice. I look forward to reading your book. What an incredible story of your mom and this innovative, compassionate school. With the young women from all over Europe, what languages were used in the classes? And were there any similar schools post-war in countries other than Sweden?
That is such a great question. So the language that was mostly used was German and sometimes Hungarian, because a lot of the kids, even if you were from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Romania, if you were from the parts that were part of the deportation to Auschwitz, you knew Hungarian. So either mostly German or Hungarian. there must have been other schools like this. Like I know Elie Wiesel, I think, went to a school in France. I know people went, if they were, I don't want to say good fortune, but I think it was good fortune if they were lucky enough to be together with other refugees who had similar experiences, who understood where they came from and what they had seen. Then, maybe they were lucky enough to be in an environment like that was close. And I'm sure in Palestine and Israel, there must have been places like that because they loved young people there. And if people were lucky enough to get there and get some schooling, they might have had similar kinds of experiences. I don't think out of the 10 Internat schools in Sweden, I think I have a feeling this one stood alone in its approach.
Bernice, I'm so sorry to hear of your mom's recent passing, and she sounds like she was just a remarkable woman. If she was here with us today, what message do you think she would want us all to walk away with?
This is sad for me because she wanted to hear this presentation. She heard so many of my other presentations, but none about, I didn't give this one before. She would probably say what she said when she spoke to school groups everywhere. She would say, try to use your education for the good of humankind, to treat everyone with respect, to see the holiness in other people, and really just stressed also that you should have hope. If you're going through difficult times in your life, things can turn around, they can get better for you. You can suffer grave loss and terrible depredations and go on and lead a meaningful life. A lot of young people were very moved by that message that she gave them. I heard the example of her life.
That is a powerful message, and such great words to leave us with and to live by and to start our new year. Bernice, thank you so much for being with us at this Lunch and Learn program today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And thank you to everyone for joining us at our first Lunch and Learn program of 2023. One of the biggest compliments you can give us is to share a program with your friend, colleague, or family member. You can send them a link to a program on our website or invite them to join live on a Tuesday, or share it on Facebook, Instagram, or your LinkedIn pages and tag the Holocaust Center. This helps others to find our programs. Please join us in 2 weeks on the third Tuesday of the month, January 17th, for our next Lunch and Learn program entitled Closing the Impunity Gap, Justice for Atrocity Crimes in Africa. We have a really great, insightful program planned. And all of our Lunch and Learn programs are possible because we have a fantastic team at the Holocaust Center. Thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, and also my partner in crime in producing this show. A huge thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and thank you to our entire team who make all of these programs and resources and good work possible. Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devonshire Lockie, Katie Lawrence, Branda Anderson, Anna Morris, and our newest member, Demetria Spinrad. Thank you again for joining us today. I wish you all a good start to 2023, and we hope to see you at our next program, January 17th. This concludes our program for today. Thank you.